Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar in Sustainable Conservation's spring webinar series, which we are titling Climate Resilience in Action. We really appreciate you all joining us today. We're thrilled to have Dr. Daniel Swain back with us again today. Daniel kicked off our fall webinar series, which was titled Recharging California. And in that series, we focused on California's weather whiplash, primarily talking about droughts and floods. And for those of you who are on that webinar, you may remember we didn't have time to answer all of your questions. And now, in the wake of Los Angeles's devastating fires, there's even more to talk about. So we decided to invite Dr. Swain back and talk about how we can work to build California's climate resilience in the face of climate change. So today we're going to spend time talking about the LA fires, the conditions that led to them, what California already has done to make us more climate resilient, and what more we need to do. Before we get started, I would like to give many thanks to our sponsor, Spotswood Estate Vineyard and Winery, for supporting this spring webinar series and for sharing Sustainable Conservation's vision of stewarding our state's most precious natural resources for all Californians. I'm Ashley Boren, CEO of Sustainable Conservation, and for those of you who don't know us, Sustainable Conservation advances the collaborative stewardship of California's land, air, and water for the benefit of nature and people. And this means that every day we're bringing together business, landowners, scientists, government representatives, water agencies, nonprofits, and others to advance collaborative solutions to steward the natural resources we all depend on in ways that are just and make economic sense. This spring, we're going to be joined by experts on fire, floods, and droughts in conversations about how we can better prepare California and ourselves for the impacts of climate change. So in a few minutes, I'm going to introduce Dr. Swain, and I'm going to ask him a series of questions, after which I'll open it up to Q&A from all of you who are joining us. And please, if you have a question that comes up while we're talking, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A box when it comes to mind. And then when we're finished with the questions I'm going to ask Dr. Swain, I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. So let me introduce Dr. Daniel Swain. He is a climate scientist focused on the dynamics and impacts of extreme events, so droughts, floods, storms, and wildfires on a warming planet. Daniel holds joint appointments as a climate scientist within the California Institute for Water Resources, within UC California's Ag and Natural Resources Division, the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA, and as a research fellow at the NSF National Center for Atmospheric Research. He holds a PhD in Earth System Science from Stanford and a BS in Atmospheric Science from UC Davis. What you will soon learn if you have not heard Daniel speak is that he is an excellent communicator and really gifted at making climate and weather science accessible. He engages extensively with journalists and other media partners to help educate all of us on the issues surrounding climate change. He also authors the Weather West blog at weatherwest.com, which provides real-time perspectives on California and Western North American weather and climate, which I definitely encourage you to follow. So we're very fortunate to have Dr. Swain with us today to talk about the ways that climate change is impacting California and what we can do to be more resilient. So welcome back, Daniel.
Thanks for having me back.
Great to have you. Just as a reminder, last fall you kicked off our webinar series, Recharging California, and our conversation focused on the changing climate in California, the projected decreasing snowpack, and the increasing volatility of our weather and what you've called weather whiplash. So for instance, going from one of California's most severe droughts from 2020 to 2022, and then to a record year in 2023. And in that conversation, we primarily focused on how California's water management needs to adapt to our changing climate, and in particular, how we can mitigate the increased flood risk that we will see and prepare for future droughts at the same time by letting flood flows spread out onto floodplains and across farmland so it can percolate into our groundwater aquifers. We've titled this spring's webinar series Climate Resilience in Action, and want to delve deeper into how California and Californians can better prepare for climate-influenced disasters like fires, floods, and droughts. So let's start with fire, because I think we're all still reeling from the devastating fires in Altadena and the Pacific Palisades, and nobody more so than our friends and colleagues who lost their homes and neighborhoods. So can you start us out by talking about the LA fires, and in particular, whether our changing climate contributed to them being so devastating?
Yeah, and I know that all of this is top of mind, of course, because this was a pretty devastating pair of wildfires that is still only a little bit over a month ago. So we're still, within 6 weeks of these disasters unfolding in midwinter, in January. And so I was hoping at least that we could get through this winter without I was not expecting to be having this conversation about wildfire in February this year, but here we are because of what transpired just last month. Well, I think as everybody knows at this point, there was a sequence of highly unusual wildfires in Southern California this January. And it's not that wildfires have never occurred in January. In fact, they do occasionally occur when you have Santa Ana wind events that time of year. Santa Ana winds, of course, are the Southern California name for those strong, dry, offshore, meaning land to sea blowing winds that occur a little earlier in the year up in Northern California. So these might be the offshore winds or the Diablo winds or the Jarbo winds, depending on where you are in Northern California. More in September through November in the northern part of the state, but in Southern California, the peak is actually from November all the way through January. So the winds themselves, they were particularly strong, though not unusually timed in January. But the big difference was, from how typically would be the case, it was bone dry leading up to that event. In fact, in some places, it had not rained meaningfully since April or May of 2024 by the time we got to the first week in January in Southern California. And for those in Northern California, that might sound odd because the period leading up to January this year was one of the wettest on record in parts of Northern California. Sonoma County saw one of its wettest November and through December periods on record at the same time that Southern California saw its singularly driest start to the rainy season. So a huge contrast between north of the San Francisco Bay Area this season and south, and that has continued to the present to a slightly lesser degree. But the setup was we had this essentially no rain from May through most of January in Southern California. We also had across inland areas and on the mountaintops in Southern California what was the hottest summer on record again last year. And then a particularly warm and dry fall everywhere. So not just in the mountains and deserts, but extending all the way to the coast. And that did include one of the single hottest heat waves on record in parts of the LA metro proper back in September. So there was all of this going on, in addition to the fact that last winter, as you mentioned, in Southern California was the second exceptionally wet winter in a row. In fact, some places saw their wettest 18-month period in LA County between some portion of 2013 through some portion through of 2014. So essentially near record wet conditions in coastal Southern California up through last spring, followed by a particularly hot summer across inland areas, and then a particularly warm and record dry fall and start to winter in the places where the fires actually occurred. It was essentially a 1-2 punch, what we were calling a wet to dry climate whiplash event. And the reason why it matters, or the order, the sequencing there is particularly important, why it's not just a question of how dry it was, although of course that was a big piece, is that in coastal Southern California, what's burning in these fires is not really forests. These are not trees primarily. There's some trees, of course, in the urban areas that burn, but to the extent that these are wildfires, they're burning in grass and brush, so chaparral ecosystems. And those are ecosystems that are highly responsive to year variations in moisture. So in the wet years, they grow more. Think of a well-irrigated lawn versus a poorly irrigated lawn. There's more biomass. There's more potential vegetation to burn in a literal weight or mass sense than there would be in a drier year. So, but that particular sequence of additional growth of that grass and brush because of the wet conditions, followed then immediately by the driest conditions on record. So the grow and then the curing period thereafter, that was that 1-2 punch, that sequence that allowed that wind event in January to produce such devastating wildfire conditions in Southern California.
Yeah, so what we could maybe conclude then is climate influenced was the weather whiplash of going from very wet and encouraging all that growth to very dry, but that the Santa Ana winds, that's something we've had always, correct? Although the Santa Ana winds, I believe this last time that's in January were particularly strong.
Right. So the Santa Ana winds in January that occurred during this event, they were particularly strong. They were not your ordinary Santa Ana wind events. That said, there's not really any evidence that the Santa Ana winds themselves are becoming stronger or more frequent necessarily in a warming climate, although to be fair, it's something that we don't really understand that well at this point. But I think a reasonable null hypothesis is that there isn't really a climate change connection to the Santa Ana winds. But where there clearly is the length of the dry season and the degree of dryness that's accumulated in the vegetation leading up to an event like this. And in coastal Southern California, that's important for more reasons than might be obvious at first glance. It's not just that you have more days per year on which fires can burn, or more days in which the vegetation is drier than it was historically. But it's also the case because of the timing of those Santa Ana winds that it really matters when you add those extra fire season days. If you were to extend the season in spring, it's not so much of a concern because vegetation in spring is inherently going to be less dry, greener, have more moisture in it, less flammable. And we also don't tend to see those the same strength or frequency of Santa Ana winds in the spring going into the summer as we do from the fall going into the winter. And so the problem there is that adding even an extra few weeks of peak dryness conditions in late fall or early winter preferentially adds them at the very highest risk time of year. And we've seen that play out in Northern California as well. I think the most tragic and dramatic example of that is probably the Camp Fire up in Butte County, which again, just to remind folks, that burned in November. in far northern California, a time when normally it would be really wet in that part of the world, but was not that year. And then the winds came, and we know what the aftermath was. This was, of course, even later in the year, uh, and and I think that the challenge here is that there's this additional question about hydroclimate whiplash. So we know that climate change is lengthening fire season, increasing peak dryness, and increasing the overlap between dry vegetation and strong wind conditions, not because it's altering the winds themselves, but because it's affecting the other piece of that joint distribution, if you will. But in Southern California and in other places where there are ecosystems or fire regimes that are really responsive to rapid changes in moisture. So imagine a desert, for example, where some dry years, there might not be a lot of contiguous vegetation that could burn in a fire, so it's very difficult for fires to spread. But in a wet year where there might be a bunch of additional grass that grows, especially in places where we see those invasive grasses coming in, those fire years that follow wet conditions might in fact be the more active ones. And in places like that, California does have pretty vast grasslands and shrublands ecosystems throughout the state, especially in the central and southern parts of the state. These are places where if there is an increase in the frequency or the amplitude of these swings from very wet to very dry, that will have an additive effect on top of the drawing trend on its own. And we do see some initial evidence that we are starting to see increased variability in late season moisture conditions in precisely these places.
Yeah, it really feels like it was this perfect storm of confluence of things that happened for Southern California with the LA fires. And you think, oh, that's an unusual occurrence, but actually it's something we do need to prepare for increasingly in the future.
Yeah, that's true. And I think it's also important to understand as well that the places that burned, unfortunately, were places that we knew were at high risk. There are links to climate change, but it certainly isn't only a climate change question. And as you alluded to, I think in your language in the introduction, a climate influenced event, I think that's the right way to think about it. I think trying to assert that this event was caused by climate change, I think is also problematic because there were lots of other factors that were really important too. And we know this is a fire-prone part of the state. These are some of the highest risk neighborhoods in the LA area. And so we knew there was pre-existing risk. We knew there probably hadn't been enough risk mitigation in these places historically. This was, in a certain sense, a disaster waiting to happen. But the reality is it hadn't happened until present. And part of why it happened when it did, and as extremely as it did, is because of these long-term trends that we're seeing. So I think then that's a broader theme maybe in California and the rest of the world where climate change often isn't inducing completely new types of events, completely new phenomena under the sun, but it's really enhancing or accelerating the kinds of pre-existing risks that were already there. Were there already potential for destructive wildfires in the LA basin? Of course, and that's been the case for thousands of years in that part of the world, long before we had big cities and subdivisions there. But is the likelihood of seeing what we actually saw in January now increasing, both due to climate change and other things that have shifted as a result of human activities? Absolutely.
So, there was a lot of misinformation that swirled around the Los
There
Angeles fire,
was.
as I'm sure you're aware, as well as a lot of finger pointing. So I'm hoping you can help us understand the facts. So maybe we could start one, which I think got the most attention, which was whether more water, if there had been more water coming through from the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta, would that have helped the LA fires?
Yeah, I think there's sort of I think there's part A and part B to if there was more water, would it have helped question. The part A is exactly as you mentioned. There were these assertions that the reservoirs in Southern California somehow had run dry because there was not enough water being sent from Northern California. And then the part B is kind of, okay, the more localized problem of the fire hydrants running dry. And if there had been more fire vehicles or more fire hydrants or better water capacity. I'll address part A first because it's the most straightforward answer. And the answer is clearly, unambiguously no. It would have absolutely no difference, mainly because there was no lack of water supply in Southern California during these fires. In fact, overall reservoir levels were higher than they would normally be in early January in most Southern California reservoirs, which is not too surprising, again, thinking back to the fact that the previous 2 winters were among the wettest on record in Southern California. So this is not really a function either of long-term drought in Southern California, interestingly, nor of north-south water wars in any way, shape, or form. It's just not physically the reality in this case. So that's the shorter answer. The part B question of whether there were issues with the local water supply in terms of individual fire hydrants running dry during the peak of the crisis. Well, we know they clearly did. There were clearly fire hydrants that became inoperable at some point during the unfolding disaster. There's no question there. But I think, you know, the challenge is that I think it's a little bit hard to conceive sometimes of the scale of the disaster and the mismatch of that enormous scale with what we design urban water systems to do. They are not designed to operate under conditions where you have literally hundreds of fire engines, each simultaneously trying to draw from the same portion of the city water grid. At the same moment, where there are hundreds initially, and then eventually literally thousands of structures that are actively on fire, each of which containing its own water pipes in kitchens and bathrooms and laundry rooms that eventually become compromised and start to leak. When that structure burns, those pipes can melt or break. Now all of a sudden you have thousands upon thousands of water leaks. In the same moment, you have hundreds of fire engines drawing very large volumes of water out of the system. There is only so much water that can go through a water pipe or a water main, even if it's a big one, per unit time. And we greatly exceed that in conditions like this. And that is just an unfortunate reality of the way urban water systems are designed. We design them for everyday use plus some margin for a minor water main leak here or there, or maybe a structure fire or two that lasts a couple of hours. But not for thousands of structures to be on fire for hours on end and then to all burn to the ground. So the challenge is that had all the fire hydrants been working, might there have been somewhat better outcome in some areas? Perhaps so, although I don't think there's much evidence that would have changed things at scale. But the real question is that an achievable outcome? Would any other city have fared better in terms of those hydrants losing pressure in a scenario like this? And I'm just not convinced, except in perhaps a very few limited circumstances, that that would have been the case, because we just don't design those water systems to be able to accommodate that kind of strain. Interesting question surrounding whether we could do that if we so chose. It's not like it's impossible, but it is complicated. It is expensive, very expensive. And so it is a sort of collective choice that historically we generally decided not to build them that way. Perhaps we'll make different decisions in the future.
Yeah, and then, I know Los Angeles generally for those areas depends on aircraft or helicopters to help fight those fires. But of course, with the Santa Ana's being up to 90 miles per hour, there was no way they could use that tool that they had to fight fires.
Right, and this was, and I think most folks have seen the footage by now, but if you hadn't, it is worth seeking out. I think if you Google Blizzard of Embers Los Angeles January 2025, you'll get the right videos. This is literally what that was. Imagine as if it were a snowstorm, a blizzard with hurricane force winds, except that each snowflake was an ember that had a potential to start a spot fire. And you can see that in the imagery. Aircraft were not able to fly at the peak of the event, and even if they would have been able to physically fly, their actions would have been completely ineffective under those sorts of conditions. And I think, the lesson there is that there are conditions under which the weather and the fire burning conditions are so extreme that there is a limit of our technological ability to stop that fire. In that moment, all you can really do is retreat and try and get as many people out of harm's way as possible and wait for conditions to become less extreme so that you can actively start to fight this. And that is what happened. And I think some folks became very frustrated when they saw that. When they saw firefighters driving through neighborhoods with houses on fire and not stopping But that is actually best practice in a wild and fire or an urban firestorm like this. You do what you can. Your first priority is to save people's lives because, especially because in many cases, your ability to achieve other outcomes is really limited under those kinds of nightmarish conditions.
It's that you're in a kind of a triage situation.
Exactly that.
Yeah, and I think also I've heard, could there have been more firefighters, more fire trucks? Would that have made a difference? And I think that gets to the point you were alluding to before, which is it is kind of a cost benefit. How much preparation can you do for an event that maybe doesn't happen that frequently, but still does happen? Uh,
Yeah, and I'm not necessarily here to defend, particular decisions or particular people. I'm sure that there were some things that could have been done better. There's some evidence that that's true, but would it have prevented the disaster or would it just have modestly modified its scope and scale? I think the latter is likely true, that even making the best possible decisions under these circumstances might have resulted in slightly better outcomes, but I just don't think it would have resulted in a tangibly different sort of disaster at scale. And I think, obviously, if everybody in the city of LA was deputized as a firefighter and everybody drove their own personal fire truck around the city, perhaps, but that's not the kind of realistic scale that we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about had there been another dozen or 2 dozen or 3 dozen fire vehicles or another 100 or 200 firefighters, and it could have helped some things, but as you say, it's a cost benefit, and I think that cost benefit analysis may shift after this event towards favoring maybe we should have those extra few dozen fire vehicles. Maybe we should have those extra personnel on days like this, despite because maybe it is worth that cost, even if it only does attenuate the scope of disasters by 10-15%, because that's still this is a big enough disaster that 10% of it is a disaster unto itself. So that might well be worth it, but I think at scale, I think what folks have really missed, and I think frankly, a lot of the media coverage has had a bit of a disproportionate focus on the proximal blame in the hours and days leading up to the event, rather than sort of the more essential contributors in terms of background risk. And here, I'm not even necessarily talking about climate change. I'm talking about the fact that these neighborhoods had long existed for decades in these high-risk corridors, and there had been very little mitigation done to make them less vulnerable to these sorts of events. And I think that perhaps if we're looking to assign political or government culpability, I think that is maybe a more appropriate target, is this long-term pattern of not sufficiently investing in community scale mitigation and community scale building standards and things like that, rather than the operational decisions during the event or in the couple days before it.
And that's where I'd love to kind of go with the conversation next, which is, given that fire is part of the California landscape and that we're going to continue to experience Santa Ana winds, and we will have more frequent and intense droughts punctuated by these very wet years, what can we do to reduce the risk of this kind of catastrophe happening in Los Angeles again, or in other parts of the state? We've had this in
Oh
Santa
yeah.
Rosa. We can name numerous places where this is happening. So maybe you could speak to some of the things you were starting to get to it, but if
Yeah.
you could speak to some of that.
And frankly, most parts of California have major population centers that are at very high or even extreme risk, at least conditionally, of events like this. And this does include places that experience fires less frequently than Southern California. There are pockets of the San Francisco Bay Area, the North Coast, that have very high but conditional risk. And it's kind of the similar conversation we were having about flood risk last year, which is that even places that don't flood frequently, it doesn't mean necessarily that the risk of an extreme flood is low. It just means that the distribution of events is such that you don't get a lot of small events, but you can still get extremely large events. This is true with wildfire in some of the moister, more coastal parts of the state, where oftentimes it's pretty darn damp, and you might go a lot of years without a significant fire because it takes a pretty unusual confluence of severe drought and strong winds and some element of bad luck to get a big fire in a place like that. But we've seen those fires in recent years. We saw them in 2020 was the last year we sort of had those big bad fires in a lot of the moister coastal forests in the state. But So this is not just a problem, an LA problem or a Sierra foothill problem or a San Diego problem. This is something that even people who live in the East Bay Hills and the North Bay and the North Coast, I think should be thinking about as well. And ironically, so folks are sometimes surprised when I say that there is a strong climate change aspect as to why this is getting worse. And yet, in the short to medium term, most of the interventions that are probably going to make the most difference in terms of fire risk in the next 5, 10, 20 years actually don't have a lot to do with climate change. In fact, if anything to do with it at all. They're motivated partly by the fact that climate change is making those interventions more important, but they kind of sidestep the climate change issue itself because unfortunately, California can't stop climate change on its own, and it's important to continue to be a global leader, in mitigating emissions and helping to solve that broader global crisis as soon as possible. But I think this is a clear case where local and regional and state scale adaptation has to happen even faster and more aggressively if we want to really turn the tide. And what does that mean? Well, the one good thing is that there can be meaningful interventions all the way up from the scale of individual structures and properties and individual property owners all the way up to state government level. And at the level of individual properties, if you own a home or another structure, you have the ability to decide whether you either build it in a fire resilient way if you're building one or retrofit it. And retrofitting it doesn't necessarily have to be a full-scale building project. A lot of these things are things that people can do on their own in terms of, the notion of defensible space, for example, having a region of less or thinner vegetation in your houses and, trimming trees for the first 6 or 7 feet vertically so there aren't ground level tree branches. That's been around for a long time. But I think what we're realizing is that we, in many cases, really need to go beyond that. And increasingly important is the notion that the first few feet around a structure probably should have little, if any, vegetation around it at all. That's in great contrast to what a lot of the homes nestled in the hills of California look like, including, unfortunately, about 15,000 buildings that burned in these fires in LA just a few weeks back. So thinking about the placement of vegetation around individual structures, and by around even just a few feet of additional clearance can make a pretty big difference. And then sort of thinking sort of in this area radiating out from structures, thinking about slightly less aggressive vegetation attenuation the farther out you go, having little or none right up against the structure. And then when you're 10 or 15 feet away, having lower shrubs or thinner, cleverly thin trees, and you go out from there. So that vegetation management around structures is usually something that is within the ability of individual structure homeowners to do, or things like adding ember resistant vents to structures. And this is a surprisingly important thing because a lot of the structures, in fact, arguably most of the structures that burned, not just in the LA firestorms this year, but in most of the wildfires in California in recent years, burned, believe it or not, in some cases from the inside out. Not because a wall of flame overtook the structure and caused the radiant heating and caused, the wood siding to ignite. That did happen in some cases, of course, but in probably a greater number of cases, those wind-driven embers blow into someone's attic or into someone's crawl space or under someone's deck. And now they enter this wind-sheltered environment, they start to rekindle, and now all of a sudden you have an attic fire, and there's no fire department that's going to be available to quickly come and limit it to your attic. Once your attic is on fire or your crawl space is on fire in the middle of a firestorm, that's probably it for your home, and possibly for your neighbors' homes too, because the most likely ignition source for structures is other adjacent structures. So this has cascading benefits, by the way. One person does these interventions, and now all of a sudden, some homes in the vicinity are at lower risk as well. So there is one of those mutualistic cascading benefit situations at the individual property level. But then as we zoom out to bigger scales, we think about building codes. We're asking a lot of questions about how to rebuild structures in LA right now. And there's a lot of notions about how we need to cut as much red tape as possible. And I'm no fan of unnecessary bureaucracy either. But my sincere hope is that the red tape that we're cutting is not fire resistant building standards, because if we let people rebuild the same buildings that burned to the ground this time, it's going to happen again. And this is, of course, true throughout the state, including in places that are outside of some of these traditional high risk fire zones. it makes sense. Perhaps the one place where I'm not as worried about are in dense urban downtown areas. Maybe fire resilient, or at least wildland fire building resilient codes are a little less important there. But essentially everywhere else, this is something that we need to be thinking about. And so that is something that's within the purview of local and regional governments, as well as the state itself, in terms of what to at least encourage, if not mandate. And then there's the question of how we manage vegetation, I think, at scale. So individual homeowners can manage the vegetation on or adjacent to their own properties, but how do we think about vegetation throughout the wildlands, and particularly in these belts that kind of surround communities, but are beyond, individual property scale? There are some more difficult questions because the answer really depends on what ecosystem you're in. In a lot of California ecosystems, one of the things we're talking about is more prescribed burning. So the purposeful burning to achieve ecological and catastrophic fire risk reduction benefits. That is something that has expanded, but not enough. And unfortunately, with recent happenings at the federal level, this is really something that California is going to have to step up and do on its own at a state and at a local level. But there are real tangible benefits to that. In some places where prescribed burning isn't appropriate, either because of the underlying ecology or for safety reasons, which is true sometimes in densely nestled neighborhoods where there's lots of homes intermixed with the vegetation, there may be other modalities. It may in some cases be things like mechanical thinning or replanting of those eucalyptus groves that are so common in some of California's hillside neighborhoods. Perhaps ultimately we decide that those are not worth it. It's not a native species to California. Perhaps that's something we need to rethink, the sort of the cost benefit analysis. So I know it's a lengthy answer, but it really comes down to the fact that there's not really any silver bullet solution. As much as we wish that we could have some magical firefighting technology or build triple redundant water systems, those could help in some cases, but they really aren't going to solve any of the underlying problems, which would be more directly addressed by rethinking how we build homes, especially, but also other structures, how we design communities for fire resilience, and also ingress and egress in terms of evacuations, which is a problem we've seen pop up repeatedly, and how we manage our landscapes at scale. And even there, it's not one size fits all. Prescribed fire is a great tool in some places, not so great in others, as is the case with mechanical thinning and other sorts of things.
So you're sort of describing a case of it's sort of all of the above.
It truly is, yeah.
A large toolbox where we can pick for particular communities what makes sense, but that it's going to be multiple solutions to try to build our resilience. So just maybe shifting out to natural disasters generally in California, because we actually have a lot of natural disasters in California: earthquakes, fires, droughts, floods, and I think earthquakes are maybe the only one that's not being intensified by climate. But a common theme really for all of them is preparation. These natural disasters are here to stay. Fires, droughts, and floods are projected to get worse. So it really seems imperative that Californian and Californians take measures to mitigate the risks and build our resilience into them. So we've talked about fire. Maybe we can delve back into droughts and floods a bit. In the webinar last fall, you gave a really great presentation with some slides to start us off about our increasing hydroclimate and precipitation whiplash, and why we're going to see both a wetter but also a drier future. We can't cover all of that today, so I do encourage our listeners on this webinar, if you're interested in that and missed that webinar, go to our webinar page on our website and you can view the recording. It's definitely worth your while. But Daniel, can you maybe summarize what we're facing in terms of greater risk of floods and droughts and how we can think about preparing for them? And then I'm going to go and open it up to Q&A with our audience.
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, I think that maybe the most essential piece of climate physics to understand in a warming world, aside from the fact that the world is, of course, warming, so temperatures are increasing, that much I think is fairly intuitive, is that simply by virtue of having warmer temperatures, the atmosphere's capacity to hold water vapor, if you will, increases exponentially with that warming. So this is the technical term would be the Clausius-Clapeyron relation, which says that essentially that water vapor holding capacity of the air increases by about 3 or 4% per degree Fahrenheit of warming. But the tangible consequence of that is something that I think can be described using an analogy that we're increasingly calling the expanding atmospheric sponge effect. This notion that the atmosphere acts like a progressively larger kitchen sponge in a warming world, more and more capable of absorbing water, and therefore, if wrung out, the analogy being heavy precipitation events and floods, yielding ever more water, but also that expanding sponge having greater evaporative potential even if it's not raining more, and that thirstier atmosphere producing more severe droughts, greater wildfire burning conditions, longer wildfire seasons, and the interaction between these two things results in a fairly widespread projected increase globally in what we call hydroclimate whiplash, these wide swings between wet and dry and vice versa. We actually, since the LA fires, believe it or not, put out a brief communication where we just took a look at the variability of wet and dry conditions in the late season in coastal Southern California, so directly relevant to the conversation we're having today. And what we found is that indeed it does look like there has been an increase in the variability of the large scale moisture in Southern California, precisely at the time of year where it matters the most for fires. And I suspect if we look, as we will soon, at the rest of the state, we'll see something similar. But interestingly, that historically has primarily come from a large increase in the dry extremes and a non-decrease in the wet extremes. So in other words, the wet extremes are just as wet as they ever were, but the dry extremes are a lot drier. So essentially you're expanding that range on one end and keeping the other end about the same. Now, eventually, in a warming climate, that expanding atmospheric sponge is very likely to give California greater wet extremes and worse floods. We haven't seen it emerge clearly yet, although we have seen the other side considerably expand as the wet extremes do not decrease. But eventually we'll see an increase in both of these things. And so that increase in whiplash will actually be coming from both sides of the distribution. And one challenge that we haven't yet clearly seen the increase in wet extremes yet is that it might give us a false sense of security, or maybe not security. I don't think too many people feel secure about what's going on, but I think a false sense of perhaps what to plan for and what to expect. If we're only planning for drier dries, we're only really capturing one half of what we are pretty certain is going to happen. And if we do that, we might make some of the wrong choices about how to adapt. And we might have a little bit of an overly myopic focus on water scarcity, which is a real and increasing issue at the expense of preparing for greater floods. So, as you say, if we're interested, I think we had that longer discussion back in the fall.
Yeah, we did, and it does make me think there's a bit of a parallel, when you think about, I think you have the arc storm flood that you have forecast could come to California with flooding like none of us have ever seen in our lifetimes. How you prepare for something that extreme is kind of parallel to the fires. Preparing and having enough defense or preventative measures to have prevented those fires seems very difficult. The same thing seems to be the case with floods. So maybe you could speak just a little bit before I'm going to go look at the Q&A, but
Sure.
There is the idea of expanding our floodplains. We have a lot of natural green infrastructure and farmland that we can use to spread out those flood flows. We can probably mitigate the flood risk, but I'm not sure we can actually eliminate it because it would take such extreme kind of change of how we have our land managed now.
Yeah, and it's not the first time this parallel between flood risk and fire risk has come up. And I think that it's a strong parallel because both wildfires and floods are natural parts of any given ecosystem or watershed. And to a certain extent, we've always lived and coexisted with them, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so. And also, I think that human attempts to completely prevent both from occurring, fires and floods, have been generally unsuccessful, and in a lot of cases have backfired. And so I think that there are a lot of parallels, in addition to the fact that a lot of the most promising interventions to both are to step back a little bit and either let the water do its thing within some semi-controlled bounds, or let the fires do their thing within semi-controlled bounds as well, specifically embracing fire and flood of a certain intensity and a certain frequency to avoid the very worst consequences from the biggest, baddest ones that we really don't want to see. And so prescribe fire. Of course, the analogy for reducing wildfire risk, expanding floodplains, doing things like flood managed aquifer recharge, and diverting floodwaters rather than trying to prevent floodwaters and trying to redirect them somewhere where they're going to do less damage and maybe even have some benefits is the way I think about it increasingly. And those are the kinds of interventions, by the way, that are particularly appropriate in the context of increasing variability and whiplash, which is one of the reasons why it's important not to forget the flood side. Because if everything were just truly getting perennially and monotonically drier, that would be a real challenge, but a different challenge, I think, than the one we're actually likely to face. And so we see this, by the way. If you look at the amount of area burned in California, yes, it has increased over time, but many fire scientists and ecologists will tell us that acres burned is not the most appropriate metric for understanding these changes. But to me, one of the more interesting things is that the variability of acres burned from year to year has skyrocketed in California. The mild fire years are about as mild as they've ever been. Just think back in 2022 and 2023. Those were pretty quiet fire years. Um, but the big years are getting much, much bigger and more destructive. And I think this is a similar thing that we should be thinking about when it comes to flood risk and the underlying physics and thermodynamics of why a lot of it continues to come back to that expanding atmospheric sponge. So there is a little bit of a unifying theme here for sure.
That's terrifying. Okay, I'm going to go to Q&A first, and then I'll go. I think some questions have got put in the chat, so I'll go there as well. Let's see. The first one is, following the recent fires, what are the lessons learned about building communities at high wildfire risk areas? A recent report indicated that more than 90% of currently approved building structures are in high risk areas. We talked about kind of the things that we can do as homeowners and builders to build fire resistant buildings. But I think this is getting at more about, should we be building in areas that are high fire risk themselves? But so much of California actually is at high fire risk.
Right.
It's a difficult concept, I think. Anyway, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, and we did talk a little bit about this. And certainly if you're thinking of building new structures or rebuilding, especially after a fire, I think the vast majority of the answer comes down to build fire resilient structures. And we know how to do this. They're not fireproof. I mean, it's very hard to build a truly fireproof structure, but you can make them far more resilient than the, quite frankly, very flammable types of buildings that we often have built in high fire risk zones in California historically. So I do think that is and remains the number one thing. In terms of, new subdivisions and expanding suburbs into high risk zones, I really do think that's a more serious question of maybe we shouldn't be doing that. Maybe we should be looking to other areas, infill and other sorts of things where we can put people that are at much lower risk of fire on purpose. I think it's a bit of a different question to ask people who already live somewhere to leave. I think it's a harder question. But I do think there's a much stronger argument for really trying to limit the further development in these high risk zones. And this is, by the way, I would be saying the same thing about floodplains in terms of flood risk. But to build, if we're going to do it, they really do need to be fire resilient structures. And in terms of places where people already live, and it's true, millions of people live in places that are at least at conditionally high risk of fire under, high wind and drought conditions. We really do need to be retrofitting the structures and rethinking the vegetation in some of those neighborhoods. That is I hesitate to call it the unfortunate reality, but I know some people will find it frustrating because it will change to a certain extent the structures we live in and what these neighborhoods look like. But I think the alternative is trying to flee these catastrophic firestorms in the middle of the night, and in some cases not being successful. I think that most folks would agree that the alternative of reducing the amount of vegetation right up against structures and thinking about replacing your vents and your wooden decks and your wooden fences is really not an unreasonably high price to pay for that increased level of security. But I also think the other piece is thinking even more seriously about how we plan for the worst case scenarios, because we are not going to retrofit all of California's structures and neighborhoods overnight. There will continue to be millions of high-risk structures in these risk zones for years or even decades to come, in all plausible futures. That involves thinking more about emergency communications and evacuations. And we got very lucky, by the way, in both Pacific Palisades and Altadena during these events that there were not even greater mass casualty events because, especially in Pacific Palisades, I don't know if folks saw the imagery, but there was that traffic jam that ultimately had to be cleared by bulldozer to get
Yeah.
people out. We are lucky that that didn't get burned over, and it did eventually in the end get burned over, but only after people had made it out,
Mhm.
thanks to some fairly heroic efforts and some fairly dramatic ones, quite frankly. That was a near miss, and those are the kinds of situations that I really think we need to work to mitigate, as well as the individual structure, the vegetation management piece. It's also how do we have better plans to have for how do people to be aware of where fires are and what they're doing, how to leave and how to get that information to people under the hardest possible circumstances when the wind may have knocked out electricity and the cell towers might not be operating. How do you get that critical information to people in a very timely way under the most difficult circumstances for telecommunications that exist? We're better than we were 10 years ago at that, but there were still massive failures in this event, and I think that's gone on and been acknowledged. And I will shout out to the Watch Duty website and app. I'm not necessarily thrilled that this became something that had to be an other than public sector solution, but I do think at this point it is the best tool that an individual person in California can have available to them to sort of know what's going on in real time. So again, a portfolio of solutions, no silver bullet, but there are things that can be done. And the good news is some of these things don't take decades. Some of these things are something you could do between now and the next fire season in California.
Okay, I'm going to go to another question. This one's coming from Marin County. Marin County has a very advanced homeowner program which provides a customized recommendation for every home in rural areas. It advises 5-foot clearance around homes and ember-safe vent covers that you were mentioning, just as you did. Marin also suggests ember-safe gutter covers and closing external soffits, am I saying that right? Which they admit are more expensive projects. Do you have opinions on cost-benefit breakpoints for such further protective actions that homeowners can take themselves?
Well, that's above my pay grade. That would probably be something to ask. Maybe some of the insurers are going
Yeah,
to start
that's a
asking these
whole other
questions very
topic.
directly. But I generally think, I mean, the way to think about it is this. I think it helps to visualize, and this is why I encourage people to watch the footage if you can bear to do it. Some of these ring cameras from the Eaton fire. So these again, these would be and envision a blizzard of embers blowing in one of the strongest windstorms you've ever experienced. Imagine each ember could ignite a fire. What are your vulnerabilities to that environment? And what would you need to change to make your home less likely to burn in an event like that? Not zero, because I don't think anybody can completely guarantee, but what would it take? And I think it is somewhat structure dependent. It is nice that you get individual recommendations from the county in that case. I know that's not available everywhere. Maybe that could be a service of the state or of counties, or maybe the University of California extension or something like that in the coming years. But uh, the cost benefit is it's difficult. One piece that I'm hoping becomes more common, by the way, is that these stratospherically expensive homeowner policies, largely because of the actual and perceived increase in wildfire risk, that people start getting major discounts on those policies in moving forward, not just one time, but every successive year that you've maintained those interventions by actually doing this. And there are some insurers that are starting to do that, but right now they're kind of token trivial discounts. I don't think they should be. Ultimately, these should be like you should be able to get a pretty large break on your homeowner's insurance if you've spent a significant investment on mitigating your individual risk, because your risk will then be considerably lower than an equivalent structure in your neighborhood. So hopefully that's something that starts to happen, and we'll can't give you an exact cost benefit breakdown, but we'll start to push it a little more in your favor, because then that's a place where you could immediately start saving some money.
Yeah, that'd be a very strong incentive to get those things done. Okay, you touched on this, but why is ignition rarely discussed in these conversations? Greater than 95% of wildfires in our climate are human caused, not naturally recurring. Please consider how to mitigate the sources of ignition.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's true, although it's not quite true that it's 95%. It is in some places at some times of year, which is true in winter in Southern California. They're virtually all human-caused ignitions. Overall, across the landscape, it's more like 70 to 80%. So it's still a majority, but it's not it's not nearly all ignitions. But in any case, the point still stands that most ignitions, particularly in urban, in the wildland urban interface setting in California, are human caused. And I do think, it's important to prevent as many unwanted human-caused ignitions, particularly under high-risk conditions, as possible. One big way we've tried to do that, by the way, is, the PG&E and the electrical utilities in California now shut the power off. That's kind of a sort of a blunt object. It's kind of not a particularly nuanced tool, but it has likely prevented multiple wildfire catastrophes in recent years, even though it has huge negative externalities and people complain about it. And I don't think it's entirely fair. I do personally believe that it is a for-profit entity shunting some of its liability off onto ratepayers. But on the other hand, there are probably wildfire disasters that have not occurred that would have occurred if the electricity had been on in some of those windstorms. So that's an example of trying to decrease the number of unwanted ignitions under high risk conditions. And the other thing that happens is that, in fact, I was almost astonished that there weren't more wildfire ignitions in coastal Southern California, given the true extremity of the winds and the dryness this winter. There really were only two really destructive fires, which is something of a miracle. They were really destructive fires, but there were not that many of them, all things considered. I mean, there's like 15 to 20 million people who lived in the region that were affected by that, and the number of fire ignitions was actually quite low. I think that's because people actually were being really careful. There's this notion that there are thousands of arsonists running around. I get this feedback a lot, and the reality is just not that. It's not to say that nobody has ever ignited a fire on purpose. There were a couple of instances of purposeful arson in Southern California during this episode, but none of those fires really took off. Now, there's no guarantee that that's going to be the case, but just for perspective, to our knowledge, none of the fires that destroyed people's homes or killed people in Southern California this year were ignited on purpose. Zero. Uh, Most of them are still human caused, though. But what does that actually mean? I think the way to think about it is that ignition, human caused ignition in an area with any significant population, is almost ubiquitous. Modern life entails lots and lots and lots of sparks. And this isn't really changing. Even as we electrify our world, even as we see more electric cars and electric appliances, those still catch on fire. Those can still cause sparks. Some of these fires started when someone's house, some appliance in their house caught on fire, their house caught on fire and it spread to the brush. Or in the case of the Eaton fire, it's looking increasingly like that might have been another power line fire. Even though the power was locally turned off, it was the high tension transmission lines that they can't easily turn off that may have sparked it. In the case of the Palisades fire, there's some evidence it may have even been a rekindle from a fire on New Year's Day from fireworks. So something that was smoldering underground for an entire week. Uh, the largest fire in California history for a while was the Mendocino Complex fire. So really multiple fires that merged together. But one of the primary ignition sources there was a worker hammering a stake into the ground with a hand tool. So they even were abiding by the don't use power tools under dry conditions kind of advice. And they just literally had a hammer and a stake. And that started what was then the largest fire in state history. So I'm just trying to illustrate how easy it is for very ordinary, mundane, non-malicious or even non-negligent human activities to generate a large number of sparks. Scale that up to the millions of people who live in California. We live in an ignition-saturated landscape. I do think it's worth working really hard to minimize those number of ignitions and sparks under high-risk conditions. Like if we know there's historically dry conditions and a major wind event coming, what might you do but issue a particularly dangerous red flag warning, which is exactly what the Weather Service in LA did. And I think that there were fewer ignitions than there would have been had they not issued that. And I know that there are folks who are worried that there's firebugs out there who are going to go and set a bunch of fires, but the reality is, historically evidence shows that people actually, on average, are significantly more careful when they get those warnings, and that there are actually less fires than there would be if we didn't issue those warnings. There's other reasons to issue them. The firefighters can pre-position resources, and local governments can staff up emergency services, operation centers, and things like that. It's a lengthy answer, but I think it's an important one because we get this question an awful lot. And it's not that ignitions aren't important, but it's that to a certain extent, we can't get rid of them unless we get rid of electricity and vehicles and modern life. And so we're going to have to live with some background level of sparks.
It's kind of a horrifying thought that those fires were so devastating in LA. I hadn't thought about the fact that they could have actually been worse if there had been more ignition. So
we are extremely fortunate there weren't 3, 4, or 5 of fires like that on that night, because each of them individually probably would have turned out worse because you have even fewer resources to devote to any one fire.
we have another question. Do you see fire safety advantages in retrofitting homes to be all electric and eliminate gas infrastructure?
Well, there are a lot of reasons to eliminate gas infrastructure. One is you are pumping a flammable substance into homes on purpose that does sometimes cause fires and explosions. It's not common, but it's also not that rare. It's a particular hazard, by the way, in urban areas in the post-earthquake setting. So bringing it full circle and talking about one of California's other major natural hazards, that is a major concern in the other big one, depending on which big one we talk about, are urban fires following earthquakes. And the main way those will ignite are essentially gas appliances that turn over, your water heater, or gas lines that break. So actually, ironically, some of the most important fire benefits from going electric would occur in the post-earthquake environment, which is not unrelated from the wildfire environment if we got a big earthquake during fire season. So that is a consideration. The other reasons, of course, are that there's growing evidence that some of the byproducts of combusting gas in your home are actually fairly toxic and were under-recognized historically, as well as the fact that you're directly burning a greenhouse gas when you could potentially be heating or cooking using a renewable energy source that doesn't contribute to global warming. So I think there's a range of benefits. There are potentially some fire benefits. The challenge is there are, certain aspects of electrification that result in their own fire risks. Battery storage, for example, we've seen this very difficult fire at up in Moss Landing recently with the huge battery complex at the power plant. That's not a wildfire issue, but it does illustrate the challenges that come with fires and electrification. And I'm not a combustion expert. There's plenty of folks who are, but it's a trade-off too, but I think it's a trade-off that's overall worth it for other reasons and does offer some fire resilience benefits, less so in a wildfire context, but in a compound disaster context, potentially actually quite a big difference.
Next question. Do you see any other communities in California that have made the change in its thinking on firestorms and floods? So I take it this question's getting at that have taken the steps to prepare for these kinds of disasters.
More places have made these proactive steps in terms of fire than flood, which is a bit of a scary thought because there's a lot of places that haven't made a lot of progress on the fire risk yet, but there are some. Some are places that have been devastated by fire in recent years. I think some of the earliest progress is probably in far Southern California. San Diego County following, I guess it was the major firestorms in 2003 and 2007. Although we do see these big sprawly subdivisions in high fire risk zones, which is perhaps not what we want to see, a lot of them have been built differently than their counterparts before that point in time. And when we have seen fires, there is some indication that the similar fires burning in San Diego County have been less destructive than those burning in LA County. Partly because I think some of these subdivisions and these individual structures were built with fire resilience in mind, and there is more vegetation clearance. I hesitate to call it a success in other respects, but I do think from a fire resilience perspective, I do think that's a part of the state where there have been some tangible improvements that have resulted in better outcomes. And there are going to be individual neighborhoods. There's even a couple of pockets of Altadena and some adjacent communities where there were more fire resilient structures and far fewer of them burned than in other parts of the city. Same is true even in Pacific Palisades, actually. Now, the problem is the scope of the disaster was so vast that even those folks, unfortunately, are in a really bad situation right now, even if their individual home didn't burn because the rest of the community did. I do think there's pockets of it. There are some communities that have done better, but And I framed this before. I think the wildfire hazard has really gotten ahead of us in California. It's worsening faster than our adaptations have kept up with it in the last 10 years. It hasn't happened yet with flood, but I'm concerned that there will be some decade in the next 20, 30, 40 years where we have that kind of experience with flood. So this is the moment to get ahead of it. With fire, we're now officially working from behind, and I hope that we can catch up and get ahead of it, but it's harder to go work from behind than being proactive. We still have that opportunity with flood, but we haven't yet taken it. So will we seize the moment, learn the lessons from fire and apply it to flood? Arguably, we have learned some of these lessons when it comes to earthquakes. Actually, California is a much more earthquake resilient place, particularly LA and San Francisco, than they would have been 20, 30, 40 years ago. Um, and we had some reminders, there's Northridge, there's the Loma Prieta quakes. We haven't really had the big one. I mean, there are since 1906, really, in California in terms of earthquakes. So we learned that lesson from the quote unquote lesser events and extrapolated to the bigger ones in a way that I think was very forward thinking and has probably will serve us well when that does eventually happen. We didn't do it for wildfire, and we're now seeing the consequences now. We haven't yet done it for flood, but we've also not yet really had to deal with the consequences of it either. And so there is that window, I think, to still to do so. I think that's the optimistic view here, is that it's always worth trying to make things better before or after, but it is usually much better to do it before the bad thing happens than in retrospect.
Yeah, and I will take a moment to plug, two examples where we have done something for trying to mitigate floods, both the YOLO bypass, near
Right.
Sacramento, which protects Sacramento from flooding. And then a plug for our colleagues at River Partners with the Dos Rios, which is at the confluence of the Tuolumne and San Joaquin River. That does protect some communities as well when we have high water years and flooding. So there are examples out there, but we definitely need more. So.
Yeah, I think in both cases, what I really hope is that we can dramatically scale up, in terms of geographic breadth and the physical scale of those sorts of interventions.
This question is, let's see, I think we got time for a couple more. As a climate scientist, what are your thoughts on the present administration attitudes about NOAA and decreasing their vital funding?
Yeah, and this is still evolving. We still don't know exactly what's going to happen with NOAA specifically, but I am very concerned. The broader concern is that what we've seen so far, and this is just backward looking at sort of a factual assessment of what's happened to date, is that there have been enormous disruptions in entities that try and protect people from risk of bad things, which is, I think, relevant to the conversation that we're having now. Entities that are responsible for preemptively trying to identify, mitigate, or respond to disasters of all kinds, including agencies as diverse as the Nuclear Safety Administration, the aspects of the CDC and the NIH that do pandemic preparedness or response, wildfire preparedness and response, extreme weather preparedness and response. These are or even, sort of, I guess you could call some of these agencies a geopolitical advanced preparation to try and prevent conflict in some cases. These are all things that are sort of aimed at defusing problems, or if you can't fully defuse them, making them less bad than they would have been otherwise. To me, I think that's the most concerning aspect of this, is that some of these initial cuts, and honestly, in some cases, it's been decimation of some of these entities and agencies, is squarely aimed at those entities that are trying to do exactly the kind of work that we're talking about would be so beneficial to do more of in a California specific context and elsewhere. So there's a couple of lessons here. One is that, at a national scale, I think we're kind of in trouble in terms of our ability to foresee what's coming and prevent it from becoming bad in any number of respects, from viruses to floods or nuclear accidents, which is a disconcertingly wide range. But the other piece is that I think it's important to recognize that California, is essentially the size and wealth of a nation state unto itself. And it's going to be really important for California to scale stuff up on its own. And the good news is a lot of these adaptation resiliency measures are things that can be, in fact, they probably weren't going to be something mandated or supported really tangibly at a federal level even before. So the good news and the bad news is that California, in some respects, kind of needs to be able prepared to operate on its own. But the good news is, I think it can for most of the things we've just talked about. Nothing we've talked about today is something that necessarily requires national level support. I know there's regulations and there are legal reasons why that can be complicated, but in principle, there's nothing, the federal government's not going to prevent you from fire hardening your home, nor is it likely to prevent communities from standing up fire resilient building standards, or from the state of California from conducting prescribed burns on state or local land. Or, so there are, I think that's sort of the message here, is that uh, there are alarm bells ringing right now for sure at the federal level, and also it really just illustrates why California really does need to be prepared to move to protect its own interests in cases where there's not going necessarily to be as much outside help as you might hope there would be.
I have a question a little bit related to this, that how can academic researchers engage with California's ongoing fifth climate change assessment and other climate change reporting initiatives? Can you answer that one?
Yeah, I am not as I'm not as directly involved with that process. I do know that I have provided a fair bit of feedback on the last California climate assessment, including what I professionally believe to be some considerable weaknesses of the approach. And greatly to their credit, the folks working on the more recent update have, I think, taken a lot of those to heart. I think a lot of some of my concerns with the previous report are being addressed in the most recent one, which is actually really good to see. The same thing is true, by the way, of some of the state agencies that I've been having conversations with the last 10 or 15 years. And, it's a slow ship to turn always, but I do think that there is meaningful reflection on the way some of these analyses are being run, the way we're sort of crunching the numbers, and the way we think about scenarios. This notion of looking beyond mean trends and looking at the seasonality and the variability and even the notion of whiplash. All of these are important concepts to be integrated into these, and I think they are. So how to engage with it? Usually the state of California puts out a pretty interactive sort of a web interface where you can sort of, even without any coding, and kind of play around with it, but just by clicking and using the different drop-down menus. Or the data, the data itself is also available, and you can do deeper analyses with it also. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like in its final form. Actually, it's on my to-do list, is to look at how it appears right now on the web. But that web portal is really important, and I do see some significant and important changes in the most recent statewide climate assessment relative to the last one. So don't assume everything is going to look the same. I actually don't think it necessarily will.
Well, we are getting to time. I'm sorry I can't get to everybody's questions. We did extend this longer than we did last time because we knew there'd be a lot of questions and we still didn't get them to them all. But Daniel, before we close out, is there anything you want to leave the audience with? Any final messages or thoughts?
I mean, I think I would just reiterate some of what I've been talking about in the last few minutes, which is that, individuals and communities and states actually do have can act on their own volition. There's actually a lot that can get done. In fact, maybe arguably even much of what needs to be done in a lot of these areas to reduce risk of wildfires, of floods, of whatever the natural hazard can be done, and perhaps is most efficiently done anyway at local and state levels. And so we need to be doing that. This is the moment to scale that up. We are seeing we really are bearing witness to, and I was just crunching the numbers, by the way, for the California Fire Science Seminar that I'm giving next week. And the statistics in terms of the structural loss and the lives lost and all of these human toll sort of numbers in California since 2015, and that's been just a decade. It's hard to believe that it's not even a full 10 years. Are just astonishing. They greatly exceed for wildfire all earthquakes cumulatively since 1906 by an enormous magnitude. And so this really has become the natural hazard of the 21st century in California. It might not remain so, and I think we run the risk of focusing too much on it at the expense of other things. But I think there's a lesson in that I think in the 1970s and 1980s, I think a lot of folks would have predicted there'll be a huge earthquake at some point, and that will be the defining disaster in the next 50 years. And then it wasn't. It was wildfire. It really was wildfire. And so being circumspect about that, it could be flood in the next 30 or 40 years. So let's instead of being caught by surprise, let's be circumspect. Let's have those conversations. Let's do what needs to be done now rather than waiting to be caught by surprise.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us again. It's, as always, it's been very illuminating and educational, and I really appreciate your time. And I will say for our audience, the subsequent webinars are going to dig into each of these natural disasters more and give some examples of what is being done or what can be done. And that will be, next one will be on fires. I think we're planning that for early April, so stay tuned. Then follow that one with floods. And then the last one is going to focus on droughts. So do stay tuned, follow either us on emails or on our Eventbrite. And if you'd like to follow our work, you can find us on social media. You can subscribe to our email list or consider a donation. These webinars and our program work are fueled by the generous contributions of organizations and individuals like you. And all new and increased donations are currently being matched dollar for dollar. So do consider donating by visiting suscon.org/give or by scanning the QR code that's on your screen. So thank you again, Dr. Daniel Swain, and thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate it and hope you have a great day.
Thanks again.